Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week's Torah portion is called Eikev, and in it, Moses continues retelling the story of the 40 years in the wilderness. And he addresses issues of loyalty and gratitude. And in particular, after Moses reminds the people to be grateful when they have been successful, to pay tribute and give credit where credit is due, that success does not come at human hands alone. Success comes because of the gifts of mind and hand and heart and soul that God has given us that enable us to be successful, to gain material wealth and comfort. And then Moses goes on to recap the story of the golden calf. And his telling here emphasizes God's loyalty to Israel, that God has made a covenant and God will stick to the covenant despite God's anger and impatience with this stiff necked people, and that God is willing to listen to Moses' intercession. God hears Moses' pleas and relents and does not punish the Israelites. But there are specific statements that Moses makes to say to the Israelites, it's not any virtue of yours. You are stiff necked people. But God made this covenant with you all, and out of loyalty to that covenant, God will continue with you. And in return, if you will now go forward and live according to the teachings of Torah, according to the instructions and wisdom that God has shared, then you will prosper. Your land will prosper, and your families and your communities will prosper. That you can be a blessing among yourselves and a blessing to the world if you choose, if you choose to follow in God's ways. And this statement of God's loyalty is really a key connection to this week's Haftarah from the book of Isaiah, chapters 49 and 50, and a little bit of 51, which is the second Haftarah of consolation, that as Israel mourns the loss of Jerusalem, as Israel feels helpless and hopeless in exile, at the mercy of more powerful nations, that God will ultimately rescue and redeem, and that their sense of shame and guilt will dissipate because God is with them, and they will know it eventually, and they will be redeemed. And this particular Haftarah of consolation, I think, connects to our Torah portion because of this statement about God being loyal to Israel at the time of the golden calf, that God still is connected even when we are sinful, even when we don't listen to Torah. And when we are suffering, no matter how much we deserve punishment for our misbehavior and our bad choices, ultimately, God is still with us. God will comfort us. And I think this message of comfort, this message of hope for the future, of a better world to come, is a message that can really sustain us in these days of our own plague. That those who are feeling stressed, who are feeling despair, how long will this go on? How long until this plague passes? How long until there's an effective treatment? How long until there's a vaccine? How do we get through this time? And we can listen to Isaiah and his words of comfort that God is with us to sustain us and give us strength, that things will get better, that we can endure, and that being sick, for those of us who get sick, being sick is nothing to be ashamed of. There is no stigma that we should attach to coming down with coronavirus, that God is someone, if we choose to use that word, we can turn to God for comfort, for strength. We can complain to God. We can let it all hang out, all our anger and our sense of loss, because God will listen and God will remain steadfast. And when the time of plague is over, the strength that we have gained through our faith will still be there to help us rebuild. That the skills that we had to learn in order to endure the coronavirus, in order to endure suffering and exile, and after all, don't many of us feel like we're in exile from our society, from what used to be normal? That sense of exile will come to an end, that we can comfort one another, that we can draw on our tradition, that we can learn from having been stiff necked, especially those who have been stiff necked enough not to realize the danger, not to want to take the precautions and undergo the restrictions, that this virus doesn't care about ourselves. And so these restrictions are necessary to protect ourselves, that the gifts of intelligence, the gifts of reasoning, and the gifts of empathy, so important, empathy, that we can use these gifts not only to sustain our faith, but to help ourselves cope, to help our neighbors cope, to be those people who work in ways big and small to bring this virus to a manageable place in our society, if not indeed to find an effective treatment, a cure, a vaccine. And we need to stop for a few minutes and remember that in the history of medicine in the whole world, the progress that is being made in understanding this virus, however much it resists understanding, and there's always a new complication or wrinkle that we are discovering, but still, scientists are making steady progress in understanding it, understanding its effects, treating symptoms, and yes, developing treatments, medicines, and vaccines. That those are blessings, those are gifts. And however rational we are, we can still choose to see that perhaps those are gifts from God to help us in this day and age. That we have tools, and we have the tools to even create better tools. And that behind it all, underneath it all, above it all, around it all, is a faith that can sustain us, that can give us hope, that can say to us, there will be a future with less suffering. And we can be a part of that. We can be partners. We can be partners with God in solving this problem. We do not have to feel helpless and hopeless in the larger sense. Yes, we have our days and we need to be kind to ourselves. And I've had some of those days too, where it's just hard to get anything done. But we still we still have the tools to communicate with each other. We still have ways to show each other that we care, to reach out, and that our faith in our covenant, in our heritage, is a source of strength, that it bolsters our resilience. This too shall pass. And so this Shabbat, as we move closer and closer to the High Holy Days, we look at not just the Torah portion for its lessons of faith, for its lessons about what makes a community successful, healthy in the spiritual sense, in the social sense. How do we improve our lives and our hearts through a life of Torah? That is a gift. That is a blessing that will help us today. And Isaiah's message of hope, of redemption, of looking forward is also a blessing and a source of strength. May you be strengthened, as Moses will say to Joshua very shortly in the book of Deuteronomy, Chazak ve'amatz, be strong, have courage. God is with us. Chazak ve'amatz, be strong, have courage. See yourself as a blessing and be a blessing this Shabbat and into the week to come. Shabbat Shalom.